soon. People there? Do we know? Good evening, everyone. I think the doors are open and you've all been allowed into this meeting. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. You're fortunate that you probably can't see me at the moment, but my name's Callum Sinclair. I'm the project manager for the Scottish Invasive Species Initiative, and I'm going to introduce what's going to happen this evening, so you know kind of what the plan is going to be, and also you can hold us to that plan. So before we actually start, housekeeping is inevitably, there's no fire drills today, so if there's a fire alarm, it's in your house. So get out your house and we'll tell us about it tomorrow. If you happen to fall off the call, you can just reuse the link that you provided already, and that'll put you back in the meeting room and someone will let you back in again. And the speakers and me will never know you've gone, so that's fine. We ask, I think that the etiquette is to put yourself on mute if you're not speaking, and probably switch your video off. That would be the request as well. We're going to plan to record this session this evening, and then we'll put it up on the website later on so that anyone who's missed it or who wants to see it again will be able to pick things up again. We've got an hour for this evening, and we've built in questions, time for questions at the end of each presentation, other than this one from me, which is just an introduction. So please use the chat button for questions. You'll see that at the bottom of your screen. If you hover over the screen, there'll be a little chat option there. You can type in your question there, but when you do so, can you make sure that you're sending it to all participants, or whatever the equivalent of that is, so that we can everyone can see your question. And what will happen is someone who's not speaking will either be type replies to you as we go, or we'll save some of the bigger questions and answer them via the presentation at the end. So that's a sort of rough working plan. Here's a programme for this evening. You listen to me, I'm Callum Sinclair. Second is going to be Vicky Hilton, who's the volunteer and communications officer for the project. She's going to tell us a little about an introduction to invasive non-native species, what they are, impacts, and how do we get them here in the first place. And then after that, there'll be some questions, and then the baton will be passed to James Simons, who's a project officer covering Pintor, Nairn, Lossy and Speyside. And he's going to talk about what makes certain species invasive and how successful, and what we can all do to help stop their spread. You'll notice that this is session 1, because there is another session to follow this time next week, which I believe is also fully booked, but again will be recorded and available, and we'll be speaking with TCV about whether we should rerun this. So if you happen to be on this one and want to come to the next one but can't get in, we'll figure out a way to perhaps repeat this later on. And here is the programme for next week. So if you're booked in, this is what you'll hear next week, and if you're not booked in, well, tough, you won't see any of this. And we'll be talking more next week about the actual practical control work and how that happens and how best to proceed if you've got an invasive species problem for a set of species that we're actually controlling and looking at in Scotland. So it's meant to be a two-start session, introductory session this evening, followed by practical control work next week. A little bit very briefly about the project. All the speakers this evening work for the Scottish Invasive Species Initiative. That's a 4-year project working in the north of Scotland from Perth northwards on the area of the map you'll see on the right. We're due to conclude in October 2021 this year, but we're likely to extend for another year to October 2022. And what we're doing is working at a local level across that big area and trying to work with volunteers and community groups to control invasive non-native species across that big chunk of mainland Scotland. And rather than trying to do that ourselves or by contractors, we're really actively trying to engage with people and get them excited and interested in their local river environment. We have a number of funders, National Lottery Heritage Fund, the major one, Nature Scot, which was formerly Scottish Natural Heritage, and then in-kind support from the the individual partners that are logoed at the bottom of the slide there. We've 10 fishery boards and trusts involved here, and the University of Aberdeen, and the project lead is Nature Scott, who have the misfortune to employ me for the duration. So quite an extensive area for the project, but working much more locally. There are 3 major areas of the project: American mink control, invasive plant control, and education and awareness. And across the duration of the project, we're trying to cover all of those. And the purpose of this session this evening, and again next week, is to share a little bit about what we're learning, what we're doing, and hopefully that might help other people individually or as groups know where to start and make a better job of invasive species control. So that probably is plenty from me. I'm just going to stop my screen. And I'm going to pass over to Vicky Hilton. Vicky Hilton's a volunteer and communications officer, is more than able to speak for herself, and I shall just pass directly on to her. Vicky, your show.
So as Callum said, I work on the project as volunteer and communications officer. So I'm going to kick off tonight by doing an introduction to invasive species, what they are, where they are, and how they got here. So we're going to start off just a quick overview. Invasive non-native species can be anything. They can be plants, animals, invertebrates. They can be huge, taller than you, or they can be smaller than your fingernail. They can be tiny. And they're found in every habitat in Great Britain, so on the land and in water, and that's both in riparian river habitats and in the marine habitat as well. So let's kick off with some definitions. Non-native, or the other terms for it are alien or introduced. So a non-native species is a plant or an animal that has been transported outside of its natural home range, and that's by humans. So that's either happened accidentally or intentionally, as opposed to a native species, which is one that's always grown or lived in a place. And in Great Britain, that's taken to be at the end of the last ice age. So when we were attached by a landmass to Europe, there was a natural movement of species. But since the ice receded and we became an island, anything that has crossed into Great Britain since then, caused by man, is what we refer to as non-native. The term non-native species, there's over 3,000 of them in Great Britain, just over 3,000 to date, and 2,000 of those are established. So by established species, we mean that they're breeding here successfully and they've settled and carried on. The other term for that is naturalised, so a non-native plant or animal that's become established in the wild. And we should stress at this point that nearly all of non-native species, about 90% of them, are harmless. It's only a minority that are actually have a negative impact. And some of them, like Sitka spruce, you can see there, is a non-native that is actually beneficial, and we actually choose to plant it. So invasive is a plant or an animal that has the ability to spread, so it spreads wildly out of control, and it causes significant negative impacts. And those impacts can be to the environment, they can be to the economy, or they can be directly to our health or the way that we live. And again, it's one of those points that often gets overlooked, but invasive species can be native. So when we're talking about invasives, they can either be native or non-native. But in the majority of cases, invasive species are non-native. And so we use that term invasive non-native species. So they're the most successful ones in their new locations, and they cause the most severe problems. Now, in Great Britain, we have an organisation called the Non-Native Species Secretariat, which is a bit of a mouthful, but they're the body that coordinates our countrywide approach to invasive species, and that's their website up there that you can see, nonnativespecies.org. And there's a ton of information on that website. So if you're looking for any facts about any species, they've got fact sheets about all the different non-native invasive species and species alerts, and lots of management information up there as well. We're not going to talk about the law tonight, but just a wee note there about the legality of invasive non-native species. It is illegal to release accidentally on purpose any invasive non-native species. It's illegal to plant or allow to spread into the wild any invasive non-native species. And if you want to know more about that, there's a link there that'll take you to a page on our website that just gives you a very brief overview about the law. How do you get all these non-native species travel from their own countries back into our country, into Great Britain? There's a number of introduction pathways, so we're just going to run through the 4 main ones and give you a few examples. So the first one is by travel and trade, what we call the hitchhikers. And quite a lot of these, you'll see down the bottom there, my pointer so I can wave around, oops, I apologise. The zebra mussel, and the zebra mussel is one of those species that can cling onto the bottom of boat hulls and get transported from ocean to ocean. The Chinese mitten crab arrived in Great Britain through ballast water. So it hitched a ride in water that was drawn into tankers in one area of the world and transported to another. This little guy, the harlequin ladybird, which I think quite a lot of people have heard about, it's had quite a lot of press in the last few years, arrived in cargo. So it came on cut flowers and in fruit and veg and in garden furniture. So cargo can be quite a way of things arriving in this country if they've not been checked properly at customs. And likewise directly vehicles. And quite a new one that's emerging is nature tourism. People travel abroad to go to national parks in other countries. They're going from sites in this country and taking potentially species all over the world from one place to another. Ornamental plants is the biggest pathway today, especially it was in the past as well. The Victorian plant hunters were quite renowned for introducing a huge number of species into Great Britain. Some of the ones you'll be familiar with: Japanese knotweed, Himalayan balsam, giant hogweed, some of the huge, stunning structural looking plants. Himalayan balsam that you can see there, very pretty pink flower, was one of them. It was brought into Great Britain in 1830 by John Forbes Royal, and he was an army surgeon who worked for the East India Company on the boats, and he was tasked with trying to find new medicinal plants to bring back to use in those days, but he just could not resist the beautiful Himalayan balsam flower, and he sent its seeds back to Kew Garden, and Kew Gardens propagated it and grew this fantastic flower. It's a very prolific seeder, so the seeds are easy to collect and people pass seeds to their friends, those friends pass seeds to more friends, and before you know it, it's right through the country. And within 20 years they found it had escaped gardens and was going wild. And even then, just 60 years later, it was declared a weed. And today there's not a single part of Great Britain where you won't find Himalayan balsam growing, unfortunately. But we just want to stress as well, this isn't a problem in the past. A lot of the plants that we're dealing with now are garden escapees, and things are still escaping today. Cotodestas are some of the, a very common one, planted in a lot of gardens because they've got lovely berries on, so they're quite good for the birds, but they do creep. They creep over walls and over fences and into the woodlands around. And the other one here, Monbretia or Crocosmia, is another one, garden escapee, that's starting to cause quite a lot of problems in the countryside. And some of these escaped out of gardens accidentally through people carrying out poor composting activities, or just dumping garden waste in roadside laybys is a big way in which a lot of plants are creeping into the countryside. And the same goes for animals. Back in the Victorian days, we're going to blame them again. A lot of ornamental animals were brought over and intentionally released into estate parks, into the countryside, like the muntjac deer, you can see there, and the grey squirrel. They thought they were cute, that they would be something interesting to have in their estate grounds and their parks. They were just intentionally released without any understanding of what the impacts of that might be. And we've had a few species that have established from releases or from captivity, things like rainbow trout, fish that have been stocked in angling ponds and escaped into rivers and managed to carry on breeding and establish themselves. And the ruddy duck was actually introduced to the Slimbridge, the wetland centre, and unfortunately it bred so quickly they couldn't keep on top of winging the ducklings, and they actually left the centre very quickly and started breeding in the wild, and then the population numbers absolutely exploded, and there's been quite a big effort since the 90s to eradicate the ruddy duck from Britain, Spain and France, because it's been a problem right across the areas. And this little chap at the top, the red-eared terrapin, anybody who's of a certain age will remember in the 1980s there was a rather popular television programme of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, and people bought these little red-eared terrapins as pets. They were quite cute things. You could put them in a little tank, not much bigger than a fish tank, and emanate your heroes. But unfortunately people didn't realise these little terrapins could live for 20 or 30 years. And as kids got bored with them and left home, a lot of these terrapins were dumped into countryside ponds. There's a few of them still around today, and they're probably quite old terrapins. They're not actually bred in the wild, so they're not established. They are a non-native species, but they found it too cold to breed in Britain. The eggs aren't breeding successfully. So hopefully that is one that will die out and not be officially established, unless of course people keep releasing them. And we've got species that have got here through commercial use, it's the term we've given it. So things like the American signal crayfish and the Pacific oyster have been either let into rivers and farmed locally. People put signal crayfish into rivers thinking that's a great idea, then we can catch them again to eat. Pacific oysters are bred in fish farms right off the coast of Scotland, England and Wales, and a lot of them have escaped from the fish farms and they're now breeding in Scotland. Too cold for them here. But off the south coast of England and Wales, we've got Pacific oysters that have now established. A very well-known example there that was brought into the country for fur farming is of course the American mink, bred for its pelts, but escaped pretty soon after the fur farms were established and was also let go by environmental activists. So there are quite a lot of them, and that's one our project specifically has been dealing with quite a lot and trying to eradicate from certain areas. And then a lot of plants that are in the countryside because they were introduced because we thought at one time they were quite useful and had a purpose. And the one in the corner there is New Zealand pygmyweed, often known by its Latin name Crassula, and that's sold as an oxygenating plant in garden centres until quite recently. And unfortunately, it just needs 1 centimetre of stem with a node on, and then it can regenerate into a new plant. So it has unfortunately got into quite a lot of rivers and ponds and just spread like crazy. And it's also moving between different ponds and rivers by recreation. And what we need to think about really is that this is an ongoing issue. Invasive species travelled and arrived in Great Britain by these means, but it's not something that's happening in the past. In fact, quite the opposite. There's a massive increase in the number of species that are arriving in Great Britain, and absolutely no indication of that trend slowing. So you can see the blue line on this graph here represents the non-native species that have become established. So they're the ones that have arrived in Great Britain and successfully bred and successfully set up populations here. And we've got the number of species across here and the years in blocks of 50 years. So this last block of 1950 to the year 2000, there were 500 new non-native species established in Great Britain, which is quite a staggering number when you're thinking about it. And that's probably an indication of the global connectivity. We've got more trade, we've got more travel, we're all moving around a lot more, and we're taking species and non-native species with us. So this really represents 10 to 12 new species becoming established in Great Britain every year, which is quite a lot when you think about it. But as we've mentioned earlier, not all of these non-native species will be problematic. And the general rule of thumb is 10% of those will. And this red line here represents the number that will have a negative impact. So they're the invasive species. So 10% of that 500 across 50 years is an average of 1 species, 1.2 species per year that we are introducing. But that's still quite scary if you think about it, that there's 1 new invasive non-native species in Great Britain every single year. So what do these invasive non-native species get up to? Why are they such a problem? We're going to have a quick think about the main impacts that they cause. The biggest impact of all is on the environment in terms of plants and animals. And these examples are just looking at plants. So the main impact is loss of biodiversity. This is white butterbur, and you can see it completely just forms a solid carpet on the edge of the River Spey. And absolutely nothing can compete with that. Nothing, no other native plants or even saplings. We've found no tree saplings are regenerating on this site because it's completely outcompeting everything that is there. We've got Japanese knotweed growing on riverbanks, Himalayan balsam on riverbanks, and these can change the diversity of the riverbank habitat, and that can have knock-on effects and disrupt the whole ecosystem of the riverbank. Thinking about things like the insects and small mammals that would live in that riverbank, And there's been studies showing that when Himalayan balsam's growing on riverbanks, that's actually affecting the diversity of invertebrates, freshwater invertebrates that are living in the river. So the knock-on effects here can be quite big. We've also got plant diseases that are reducing biodiversity. Again, in the news of the last few days is town Newport in Wales felling something like 8,000 ash trees. And that's because of the ash dieback, which is a non-native invasive fungus that arrived from Asia. So there can be disease implications as well. And then we've got specialists like Himalayan balsam attracts pollinators. The bees love balsam. It's got great big showy flowers. It's got loads of nectar. It flowers quite late in the year. And while you think that might not be a problem in itself, there's a question thinking that it's attracting all our pollinators away from our native flowers. So there's a thought that our native flowers aren't getting pollinated. And then we're seeing problems with bank erosion as well. This picture actually shows Japanese knotweed on this bank here. And it's a particular issue actually with Himalayan balsam again, because balsam is an annual, so it dies back every winter. And because it likes growing on the riverbanks, it means the riverbanks are just left completely eroded to bare soil. And then when the river levels rise and we've got water flow, we're seeing bank erosion, and that washes soil and sediment into the rivers, and that can cause problems for salmon spawning. It can cause blocking of small channels, which can lead to flooding. So lots of knock-on effect in the environment. And we've stuck on the bottom there chemical use, because the more invasives that there are growing, the more pesticides and herbicides we're having to use to control them. So that's another kind of secondary impact of environment to the environment. In terms of animals, these again, the main impact is a loss of biodiversity, but animal impacts tend to be more direct on other native species. So the American mink up here caused a catastrophic decline in the number of native water voles through predation. It can actually get inside water vole burrows, which no native predator can. So it's absolutely devastated water vole populations in the last kind of 20, 30 years. Grey squirrels carry a parapox disease. A lot of people are aware of that one. They carry the disease, but it doesn't usually affect grey squirrels. But unfortunately, our native red squirrels are very prone to it, and it actually kills our red squirrels, so we're having serious knock-on effects there. And there's a lot of work going on red and grey squirrel. This little guy down here is a ringneck parakeet, and there are huge populations of those in London and Kent now. They live in parkland in numbers of thousands of them will gather together at dusk. There's actually quite a significant population in Glasgow now, and populations in Edinburgh parks as well. So it's spreading right around the country. And although you might think, oh, it's quite nice to see a different parrot for a change, it's competing with our native birds quite a lot. So it competes for nest sites and food. So it's putting our native birds at a disadvantage because it's a bigger bird. And finally, we've also got hybridization. So these are sika deer, which come in from, were brought in from Asia, again, as an ornamental for parklands. But they're very similar in size and stature to our native red deer, and the two species can actually interbreed. So we're getting a genetic loss of diversity in our red deer herds because they're interbreeding with these sika deer. So as well as environmental benefits, as well as environmental impacts, we've got a lot of economic impacts as well. And again, the big one that most people are aware of is Japanese knotweed. It can damage buildings, it can grow through the smallest little crack in a pavement, in building foundations. And as well as direct costs that can affect property values. There's a whole business around removing Japanese knotweed before you can sell your house. And it's estimated £165 million is spent every year in Great Britain on managing Japanese knotweed alone. And then we've got other impacts like crop and forestry damage, grey squirrels and rabbits. People forget rabbit is a non-native species. It's one of the worst invasive non-native species in terms of impacts, because it costs a fortune to the forest industry and the agricultural industry, and the damage it does to agricultural crops and to tree browsing. This one's deer damage, but rabbits and grey squirrels are a big problem in the forestry industry as well. And a term we use here, biofouling. This is an example of biofouling. This is a boat propeller that's got an animal growing on it. This is zebra mussels, tiny wee mussel. and they just cling on to anything and can grow on anything. And it's becoming a problem in the marine industry, because all this needs to be cleaned off before the boat can be used. And they will also grow water pipes. So the utility companies are having quite a problem spending a lot of money putting special filters over pipes. So these little zebra mussels and quagga mussels can't get into them and block the pipes. And it can also affect tourism and recreation, especially in Wales. Some of the countrysides now are just covered in rhododendron. And some people like that, but some people are put off going to an area if it's changed in character. And the number at the bottom there is the number of 1.7 billion pounds spent every year in Great Britain on tackling invasive species. So it's a significant chunk of our economy, significant amount of money that we're spending on these invasive non-native species. And the final impacts they can have on our health. And again, you've probably heard about giant hogweed. This big white ball flowering plant grows to about 12 foot tall, and it's got extremely nasty sap. You just have to brush against the leaf or a stem. You don't even have to break it. And it's got fine little needle-like hairs that if you touch your skin, this sap, when it reacts with sunlight, it'll burn and blister your skin really quite seriously and quite badly. And can cause quite a few long-term skin problems. And you've got plants that can block access. This is Japanese knotweed. You can see there is a path here. Well, there was a path here behind these people, and it's now like a little tunnel fighting your way through the knotweed. And that's both on land and in water. This is actually a canal. It looks like an area of grass, but this is floating pennywort, which is another invasive. When it gets in the water, it just spreads. And although barges might be able to navigate the way through it, a kayaker or a paddleboarder would not be able to force the way through that. So some of these invasive species start impacting very much on our enjoyment of the countryside as well, and our access. So just a couple of thoughts to finish with. As we said, invasive non-native species have now been classed as one of the top 5 drivers of biodiversity loss worldwide. They are a significant problem on a global scale, more so than things like climate change, and only second to kind of habitat loss and destruction and different use of habitats. So they are very much raising up people's importance level in terms of awareness. And this was from a 3-year report studying global biodiversity, that they're now one of the top 5 reasons that nature's changing and we're losing biodiversity. And a lot of people do ask and mention climate change. Invasive species, especially in Britain, are likely to be more widespread as the climate changes. We're seeing warmer winters. So some of those species like that Pacific oyster that aren't breeding off Scotland because it's too cold. We could see changes where a lot of these species that have non-native species that have come from warmer climates are going to be able to survive now in the British climate. And we're seeing impacts like a longer growing season, which might benefit non-native plants and put things out of sync in terms of plants and animal breeding at the same time. So food for thought there. And I will sum up there and leave it at that, and let James carry on and tell you a bit more about invasives in a moment. But I don't know if there's any questions now, or you want to carry on.
Okay, Vicky, there was just a couple of questions that came through. One of them was about Sitka spruce, which I think has been answered on the chat box, but the other one was about Japanese knotweed, and it was basically about our view as to essentially the scale of the problem, because obviously that appears in the media quite a lot. And someone was asking, I think, just, you know, how big a problem is that for property owners? It's sort of something suggested it can destroy your property, and what was our view, whether that was an overreaction or our view, and whether it was correct or somewhere in the middle, perhaps. I wonder if that's one you might want to take. We could all answer that, but why don't you have a go?
I think definitely there are some overreactions. There are a lot of private companies that specialise in removing Japanese knotweed. As I understand it, there are issues. I mean, legally, if you're building houses and dealing with a building site, you have to remove it from the building site. It's classed as an invasive weed, so you can't have it on your property. So for the building industry, it costs a lot of money and is a big problem. For individual householders, it's not quite the scary thing people make it. It can't grow through pavements. That's a myth. If there's a crack in the pavement, it will come up through the crack, but it's not going to start forcing itself through concrete. But yes, it does come in through foundations if you've got cracks in your foundation, and it will find the tiniest little crack and come inside a house and up walls. I'm not clear on the legal position, but it used to be the case that there was people struggled to get mortgages to buy a property if you had knotweed growing on the property. It's not illegal to have an invasive species growing on your land. It's illegal to let it spread. But I think there's been some clause changed in mortgages. I'm on dodgy grounds now, I don't know. But I think, yeah, in terms of home ownership mortgages and for the building industry, it is still a massive problem.
Yeah, I think that's a fair summary. I think it's one of these issues where when it is in your land, often it thrives when ground's disturbed, and particularly on new build sites, you'll find soil being moved around in new build sites in little fragments, throwing up young plants for a period of time, and it's just going to be dug out and removed and disposed of. But they're not going to sort of destroy and have buildings crumbling to the ground, and that's where the hyperbole of the problem has kind of blown it up out of all reasonableness.
There's a lot of companies going around giving you a certificate to prove that your property is clear of knotweed, which I don't know,
Yeah,
how much value that actually holds.
I don't know. I think that's the only other question that's come in at the moment. So I'm just going, because we've just ticked past 7:30, and James goes on a bit, as we know, Vicky. So what I'm going to suggest we do is give James a chance to put his slides up, share his screen, and then carry on. James is a project officer covering Pinterny and Lothian Spey, and he's going to talk us through a little bit about, you know, what makes species invasives and how they function. James, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for that introduction there, Callum. I don't need to say who I am anymore. So good evening, everyone. This section, we're going to look at why some non-native species are so invasive in the UK, and we'll look at a couple of examples for both animals and plants, and then we'll go on to look at some of the things we can all be doing to mitigate some of their impacts, which will lead on nicely to the second session next week. So Vicky touched on it already. A non-native species will not necessarily become invasive. The ones that do are a very small percentage. I think Vicky said 10% of new introductions into the UK will become invasive in time. And the ones that we're dealing with at the moment tend to exhibit a common range of traits. So I've put some very general ones up on this slide. They tend to be adaptable animals or plants, efficient at dispersal, with a lack of local predators or grazers. They're often pioneering, so they can take advantage of unfavorable habitat, and often they're aggressive in either their behavior or their growth habit. So we will go on and we'll look, I think it's animals next. So more specifically with animals, they tend to be highly mobile, so either actively or passively, so they can move long distances, as is the case with the American mink that we'll look at in a minute. Or passively, they perhaps become attached to fishing nets or taken into ballast tank water, and they can be moved very easily through those sort of mechanisms. A lack of predators or local competition, aggressive or bold. They're adaptable in their habitat, so they perhaps can occupy a lot of different areas, and they're also adaptable in their diet. Perhaps they've got a more wide-ranging diet than our native animals, and therefore better placed to survive and thrive. And often, as Vicky said, they can carry diseases which might not necessarily affect them, but might affect a native equivalent. So the grey squirrel and the red squirrel that Vicky mentioned, the perfect example of that. And these combinations of these traits mean they can thrive in the UK, and quite often they can have wide-ranging effects on our local ecosystem. So we'll look at two examples. First, we'll look at the American mink, one of our most widespread invasive non-native animals. As Vicky mentioned, they've had a devastating impact on our waterfowl population. I think it's, I hear different figures, but it's above 95% reduction in the population of waterfowls, and it's in a direct correlation with the increase in the mink population. But it's not just the waterfalls. They're a generalist, so they'll catch and eat anything. So they have a significant impact on ground nesting birds, other small mammals, fish species, amphibians, crustaceans. They will really just eat about anything. They're pioneers. They will live in an environment, so long as there's some sort of food, they will live there. The exceptions really being very high upland areas and moorlands. They're a voracious predator. They will chase down anything and everything, as I've already mentioned. And a key thing here is there's nothing to control them. There is no predators in the UK that will kill and eat a mink, whereas in North America, where they come from, there are a few species, wild cats, owls and things like that will hunt them there to keep their numbers in check. They're semi-aquatic, which is a little different to its cousins in the UK. It'll hunt on land and in water, so it has very little competition, and it can avoid it if it needs to. Its closest competitor is the otter in the riparian environment, where it'll be competing for fish and things like that. But if there are otters present, it can move out onto land, and it's just as comfortable hunting rabbits in scrubland along with the stoats as it is swimming and chasing down fish. So it's very adaptable, which is what has made it so successful in the UK. And as already mentioned, it's got far-reaching dispersal. It's a very effective disperser, and individuals can travel up to 100 kilometers to find a breeding territory. That was discovered during the Mink Initiative, our predecessor, where Aberdeen University carried out an excellent study on it. They found mink from Dundee were being found in northern Aberdeenshire and Murray a year or two later. And that was based on genetic testing. So quite incredible. The next one was the zebra mussel. Vicky mentioned a little about some of the impacts of the zebra mussel. But again, it follows these same traits that we're looking at. It's pioneering. It will attach to any hard surface, so it can take advantage of unfavorable habitats. Quite often they're found on lock gates, water sluices, boats. And as you can see from that lower picture, the top picture there is a zebra mussel. You can see why it's called a zebra mussel. But the lower picture there is a native painter's mussel, a freshwater mussel, with a colony of zebra mussels actually embedded themselves on it. So they're aggressive. That's one of the traits we mentioned before. And it will grow even on live native mussels to their detriment. They reproduce quickly and spread with ease. Again, they can attach themselves to boat hulls, fishing gear, and they will be transported around the country passively. I've already said the mobile bit. They're very adaptable in terms of their environment. A lot of our freshwater mussels need high quality habitat, whereas the zebra mussel can tolerate low oxygen, can survive out of water for up to 3 weeks, so long as it's damp and moist. It can also tolerate a very wide pH variance, so anything from acid to alkali water, whereas a lot of ours won't tolerate those environments. Its diet, it can filter up to 1 litre of water a day, and that denies our native species the nutrients within that water. So a lot of our aquatic plants that might rely on those nutrients are going to be starved of them a little bit. And that filtering also clarifies the water. So it removes sediment, it removes nutrients, and that actually promotes the growth of more aggressive non-native aquatic plants. And we'll look at one of those when we look at plants in a minute. Whereas our native aquatics are slightly slower growing, they might need a higher nutrient content to grow successfully. And an interesting one I found out is it actually alters fish populations because they colonize spawning grounds for certain species, and the entire makeup of the fish population in that waterway can become altered because a certain species won't be able to spawn, whilst another one will. That's an impact. It's not really a trait, but I find it quite interesting anyway. So there's a couple of animal ones. Now we'll look at the invasive plants. Again, they tend to exhibit similar common traits, but when applied to their plants a little bit, we're looking for high seed counts or robust rhizome systems. So rhizome, for those who don't know, is a underground root network where all the plants are interconnected. The Japanese knotweed and white butterbur are two very good examples of that. Often you'll see one stand of Japanese knotweed, but that'll actually all be one interconnected plant with hundreds of stems. Quite often they have early vigorous growth. So we saw the picture Vicky showed us of the white butterbur, that whole carpet of those dinner plate size leaves. They're up and out already, and by the end of May they will be almost fully grown. Just at the time when our native plants are looking to germinate and start putting a lot of effort into growth, there'll be no sunlight for them. So that's one way they outcompete. Often they'll have large leaves or tall, dense growth. Again, we'll look at some of those in a minute, but it's a similar pattern to the white butterbur. Creates shading, it creates competition, and they can grow on unfavourable ground. So quite often, as Callum mentioned a minute ago about the building sites, if you clear an area, the invasive plants are usually the first ones to colonize it. So often you'll see spoil heaps from digging works on a river, and it'll be filled with Japanese knotweed or Himalayan balsam or giant hogweed. So they're very quick to take advantage of any new habitat that opens up. And unpalatable to native grazers. So our local fauna hasn't, evolved or adapted to eat these plants, and quite often they're just overlooked. You'll perhaps, if you're on next week, learn about some trials we're undertaking about grazing, but for the most part, our native fauna stick to what they know. And often there's a lack of native pests that actually keep a natural check on these plants. So a combination of these traits mean they can outcompete our native flora, and they come to dominate habitat, as in some of the pictures you saw in Vicky's, and some of the pictures we'll see shortly. So just applying some of these to a couple of plants, we'll look at New Zealand pygmyweed, also called Crassula helmsii or Australian stonecrop. It was introduced in the 50s. As Vicky said, it was an oxygenating plant for ponds, but now it's quite widespread across GB, Great Britain. And it's become widespread because of these invasive traits. It's pioneering. It will colonize bare sediment and terrestrial mud. It doesn't have to grow in water. It can grow on boggy and damp land as well. It's got very vigorous growth that will form these large mats, like you can see in this picture here, and they will just a very dense mat where nothing else can grow. No sunlight will get through to the lake bed or riverbed. It is just pygmyweed. Again, nothing eats it. None of our aquatic animals graze on it. There are some studies being done with grass carp, but grass carp isn't a native fish anyway. It is widely stocked further south, but you need a lot of grass carp to get through on that like that, I think. Again, it's got a wide pH tolerance, so acid and alkali will grow in a wide range of water conditions. It can even tolerate low levels of salt, so sort of brackish conditions in estuarine areas. And this one doesn't actually have a rhizome or set seed in this country. It reproduces through vegetative means, but only needs a 10mm piece of the plant with one growth node on it to create a whole new mat like that picture you're seeing. So it's very easy to break off something like that if you're wading or if you're going through with a boat. even wild fowl can break this one up and transport it to a new location. So it's incredibly invasive, and there's a lot of work being done with the Scottish Canals Trust at the moment to see if they can find a successful way of treating this one. But as you can see, a mat like that just completely outcompetes all of our native flora, and it shades out the bed below, starving the benefit community. So that's the invertebrates and amphibians living on the bottom of the lake, starves them of all light, and can create quite a dead environment underneath it. So next, we will look at Himalayan balsam. I'm sure anyone who's been out doing a bit of invasive volunteering will have come across Himalayan balsam at some point. It's one of our favourites. It's one of our most widespread in the UK. Again, it displays many of the same characteristics. It will grow anywhere. It will grow on bare waste ground. It's an annual that grows from seed, so it regrows every year, and it's very quick out the blocks. They're already germinating, a couple of centimetres high at the moment, and that's up in Speyside. So further south, I'm sure they're a bit further on than that. Got a very high seed count at about 800 seeds per plant. And given the density they grow in, that's a lot of plants per square metre. There's no diseases or pests in Great Britain. You may well have heard of the trials of the rust fungus that we're undertaking in Scotland. I think it's on the Tweed. They're releasing a fungus to see if that will stem its growth to a certain degree. And there's been some mixed reviews, but it seems to be going quite well at the moment. It's a very efficient disperser. The seed capsules on Himalayan balsam actually ping the seeds out. I've got a video on the next slide. You'll be able to see that. But their seeds can actually travel up to 7 meters away from the plant, and that's without other means of dispersal that we'll look at in a slide, a few slides time. And again, it grows very tall and dense. I've cleared these plants up to about 10 feet tall, and nothing else grows in amongst it when it gets fully established. We did, I think it was about 2 acres on the Nairn a few years back, and it was just 2 acres of Himalayan balsam along a very rich riverbank. Luckily, it's coming back. So here's the video of the Himalayan balsam. You can see just by the fingers there, that is a ripe seed pod. And I'll just hit play. Bing. You can see just with a little squeeze of the seed pod there, it sends the seeds absolutely flying. So it can spread very quickly without any help from anything else. It just takes a small animal rubbing up against it, and the seeds go flying. So we'll look at some of the dispersal mechanisms now. We found out some of these traits that make a non-native species potentially invasive. And we mentioned about the seeds, plant fragments, and rhizome fragments. So let's look at some of the ways these seeds and rhizomes can be dispersed throughout a river catchment or a local area. So first, we've got to look at the natural dispersal corridors. The first and most obvious one is it's waterborne. A lot of these plants grow near water very successfully, and rivers rise and fall with the seasons and the rain. And when we get a flood, it will wash all of those seeds down the river to settle in a new area. When we get proper flood, some of the soil will be eroded on the riverbank, and rhizome fragments will snap off. And it doesn't take much of a rhizome to create a new stand of that particular plant. It's a very natural way of plants spreading, and that's why often you'll see similar plants all along a river, because that's how they spread. Wildlife's another one. A lot of seeds are sticky, or just kind of jaggy, and they'll get caught up in fur and feet and things, and the wildlife will move them around. Sometimes birds will eat them and then deposit them somewhere else. So wildlife are very efficient dispersers of plant seed in general. But now we'll look at some of the it's a bit late in the day for that word. Some of the human mechanisms of dispersal. Recreation is a big one, and there's been a big push on this for the last decade or two. Fishing, kayaking, also any sort of activity that takes you into areas with these invasive plants with a lot of kit introduces a number of ways we can be taking those plant seeds or larvae from animals away from the river and perhaps into a brand new watercourse. So with fishing, you can think of the nets. With kayaks, it's in the boats, growing on the holes, things like that. Here we've got equipment, and I'm just going to move my cameras, and clothing. So boot treads, waders, things like that. Woolly jumpers. I mean, peri bird will stick to woolly jumpers or trousers very, very easily, and then you take those away, or you go walking further up the river or through the woods, and you're just transporting those plants further away from their source, and just spreading the problem. And then transport's another one. So roads, rivers are a key dispersal mechanism for invasive plants, but so are transport networks. Very often you'll see train tracks are just littered with various invasive species, not always non-native, but a lot of knotweed, a lot of hogweed, a lot of Himalayan balsam, all the way along train tracks, especially when they cross rivers, because when those two meet, there's a greater opportunity for them to spread and disperse. Let's move that back. So just looking at that in context, this is an actual example on the River Spey. I haven't named any locations, but this is how giant hogweed spread on the river. So you'll see, how do you get that pointer up that Vicky got? No, I'm not going to play with that right now. You'll see there's a black house with a black spiky plant there. So that's an estate house that 100 years ago planted some giant hogweed close to a burn. And that giant hogweed did what giant hogweed does. It set seed, it dropped its seeds into the water, and the plants slowly spread along this burn. You can see this green arrow here pointing down towards the main stem of the river. And a few became established, not lots, no one did much about it. And then it entered the main stem, and we're following the green pathway at the moment. And more plants grew, more seeds fell, until you get to the bottom end of the river, where you have a complete jungle of giant hogweed. And we're still just looking at the green ones. But on this little tributary up here, by our initial source, quite close to it, there's actually a footpath. Walkers come through, they might pop down to this little tributary, have a look, maybe grab some water, or just have a guddle about. And they picked up a giant hogweed seed on their boot tread, and off they went walking along the path away from the river. And you can see there in both directions, because people walk up, people walk down, they've inadvertently taken seeds away from the source tributary and away from the river, where individual plants can establish. And then further upstream, one of these plants set seed, and perhaps an otter or something took another seed down to the river, and it started a higher up infestation. And then as we come down, further down the main stem of the river, so this is two introduction pathways here, or dispersal pathways. We've got a train track crossing it. At one point, these dropped some seeds nearby, and trains come whizzing past. Giant hogweed seeds are big, but they can still be blown a fair distance by a gust of wind or the backdraft from a train. So the giant hogweed in this location has now started spreading along the train tracks as well. And eventually, if left untreated, it will find another burn, perhaps in another system, and the seeds will drop in there and it will all start again. I won't go into too much more detail about this just now, but you'll notice as we get further down the river, the plant concentrations increase, and that's generally the pattern we see. My colleague's going to go into this in a strategic sort of way next week in a bit more detail. But this is your typical introduction pathway. We've got low concentrations of plants higher up the catchment, and then a greater concentration down towards the river mouth. And any river with an invasive problem, you can observe that yourself. Have a walk along the river and see how it changes. So what are we going to do about it? How can we help, or at least reduce the spread of these plants? We're going to look at practical control and management next week. But for now, we're going to look at the need for biosecurity. Biosecurity is about reducing the risk of introducing or spreading invasive non-native species throughout the countryside. So we've already looked at some of these: boats, fishing tackle, bike tires, walking boots, wellies, even serving equipment and dog paws, all possible vectors for dispersal of these seeds or rhizome fragments, or indeed eggs or larvae. So we need to be aware of this whenever we go out and about, and just take some precautions to make sure we're not adding to the problem. So some of you may have come across the Stop the Spread campaign, Check, Clean, Dry. It's a very basic biosecurity routine that, if you follow it when you're out and about, really does do a lot to reduce the risk of transporting invasive non-natives away from their source. So before leaving site, check your footwear and equipment for debris, and carry a basic biosecurity kit. So a hoof pick brush, and maybe some water, just to clean your boot treads off, basically. When I forget mine, I find a stick's just as useful. Clean and wash footwear, clothing and equipment, ideally on site, especially if you're in an area where something like killer shrimp or American signal crayfish are. If you've been in the water, there's a chance you've picked up some eggs or larvae. Definitely make sure you are washing your kit down, possibly with a stronger detergent. And then dry. You've got to dry your kit and footwear really well, because as with the zebra mussels, a lot of these invasives can survive out of water in damp conditions for quite a long time. So you might go fishing, put your nets back in the bag, leave them there. They'll still be wet next time you take them out. And you might go fishing in a new lake or river and transport the problem there. We've got quite a lot of information on biosecurity on our website. You can see the link at the bottom there, invasivespecies.scot/biosecurity. There's a lot of links and things to external sites as well. So the Check, Clean, Dry campaign has been targeted at different users. So these are just two examples here. You can see one's very much targeted at boat users, so kayakers, and the second one there's targeted at fishermen and anglers. And they're quite clever. They change their priorities and the way they sell it to them to a certain degree. But we don't need to go through that just now. So another campaign, apart from the Check, Clean, Dry, obviously that's dealing with a lot of problems that we already have on our waterways. It's very sort of waterway based. But the next big threat in invasive introduction is actually our gardens. That's how a lot of them have already arrived, through the Victorian plant hunters that Vicky mentioned. And today we're still looking for amazing exotic plants to put in our garden. So the GB Non-Native Species Secretariat, that's a mouthful, have launched this Bee Plant Wise campaign. It's got 3 basic things again. Instead of check, clean, dry, it's know what you grow. So choose the right plants for your garden, pond or water feature. Stop the spread. So make sure you're keeping your plants in your garden. Don't plant them or allow them to grow in the wild. And compost with care. So dispose of your unwanted plants, roots, weeds, seeds and seed heads with care. You don't want to be just chucking giant hogweed seeds or Japanese knotweed stems or the modern day equivalent over your back fence. Quite often you see interesting plants on the river where a back garden meets the riparian woodland just next door. So that often leads to a knock on the door. But yeah, it's something to really be aware of and try and get the message out there, because a lot of people love their gardens. I love my garden. But you've got to be careful what you plant, especially if you're next to a woodland or a river. So what do you do if you see an invasive species, an invasive non-native species? Report it. I can't overstate enough how important it is to report sightings of invasive non-native species. You should report them to your local relevant organisation, the landowner or project, because even if we're unable to undertake control at the time, just collating that information on densities and distribution is incredibly important for planning future management and control work. So don't just see it and go, oh, I can't believe that's just sitting there untreated. Let someone know about it, because I'm always finding new stands of this, that and the other that I didn't know about before. And you'll see again, there's a link to our website. And there's a lot of really useful information on that report sightings. You can report directly to us if you're within our project area and it's one of our target species. But there are also links to external organisations and things like that. So it's very useful. So what can you do in general? This is more of a summary about what we just spoke about. Not everyone is able to actively manage invasive species, but everyone can do their bit to help. So we just mentioned reporting and how important that is. Everyone can practice good biosecurity when they're out and about, just making sure you're not carrying hitchhikers away from the area you've just been in. But of course, volunteering, if you're able to get out and volunteer, that's a huge help. And there's many ways to do that, whether it's getting involved in plant and animal control projects, or just walking a stretch of river to help out with some of our invasive species surveys. So please do go and have a look at our website. You see a link again at the bottom. And obviously the TCV have lots of opportunities as well for volunteering, because every single contribution is very, very valuable. And I think that's it. Thank you for listening. I hope I haven't bored you too much. If there are any questions, I will do my best to answer them. Okay, thank you, James. We're just running a few minutes over. We're about 8:05. There's a few questions have come in which have answered as they've come through. But one which was one we get asked quite often just came in at the end there from George about who's controlling invasive species south of Perth, which basically means who's taking care of things outside our project area. There's a bit of a mixed bag of an answer here, George, as you would imagine. There are established invasive control projects on the River Tweed and their catchment run by Tweed Forum. Organisations like Forth Rivers Trust in the past have had invasive control work, but aren't currently involved in that on a large scale. And underneath that, then it's really about the obligations of individual landowners. And I think Vicky mentioned at the beginning that we've not introduced the whole legal spectrum in the talks this evening. But there are obligations for landowners to prevent the spread from their own land to neighbouring land, but there's no actual legal obligation for a landowner to undertake control. So it is a little bit of a scattergun
when you come outside these sort of structured projects. But I think, you know, there's certain species are always going to be more likely to trigger a response. So hogweed, for example, has often been controlled by local authorities because of the public health risk to allowing that to stand in public areas. But equally, other species are so widespread that you know, they're going to need to prioritise where resources might go. So a bit of a long-winded answer there to say it's a little bit fragmented control outside actual structured projects, but there are organisations on weed and some of the other catchments that do undertake control with some landowner obligations, but no essential requirement for control. I don't know if there's anything else that James or Vicky wanted to add to that, or if that's covered it.
Nope, I think that's covered it. There's just another question come in there at the end. Do you offer training for volunteers? Which we're pleased to say yes. The main part of our project, as we're running as the Scottish Invasive Species Initiative, is to work with local communities and local people and either train them ourselves in just awareness of what different plants look like and what the issues are, so they can be dealt with locally. And we are also able to fund the volunteers we work with in the community to put them through their pesticide training, pesticide spraying qualifications. So when our project comes to a finish, which is going to happen, hopefully we've built that community capacity by training up local people, whether it's in village communities or angling communities or just individuals, that they can then be supported by the Fishery Trust and the Rivers Trust locally to continue that invasive species work. So yeah, a lot of informal training from guys like James on the ground, and we can have a budget for supporting volunteers with qualifications. Thank you, good question, Rebecca.
Yeah, so there's information on the website about volunteering, so that'd be worth having a look there. And you know, just we've probably spent in excess of £50,000 actually training volunteers over the duration of the project, and we've got budget to carry on that work in areas where we're obviously active and where the volunteer has, you know, or the community group's got a commitment to helping us help themselves, basically. Don't know if there's any further questions coming in. I've not seen anything else in the chat box at the moment. Well, there looks like a potential customer, Vicky. Rebecca's, I'll be in touch. There's always a bit, can take that either way, but we'll take that in the right way, Rebecca. We look forward to hearing from you. Okay, if there are no further questions tonight, do please be quick if you want to put them in. While I'm busking for time a little bit and give you a chance to talk, just to say thank you very much everyone for taking the time this evening to join us. Thanks also to James and Vicky for the contributions, and for our friends at PCB Scotland for actually helping put this together with us jointly. There is another session next week. I understand it's fully booked, but in looking at the numbers, we thought this was fully booked this evening as well, but there's a significant number of people who have not turned up. So what I'm going to suggest is that I think if you're interested in coming along next week, then do register, and they'll be on a waiting list, and we'll chat with TCV about how we might better organise that so that people who want to come can attend. I think maybe the clock's changing at the weekend has given everyone a little bit of daylight to do something a little bit more interesting than listen to us. But hopefully you've enjoyed what we've had to say, and there's been something of interest to you this evening. Do sign up for us next week. Do follow us on social media or have a look at our website, and the contact details for the project team and us as individually and our colleagues who are and be part of this next week will be available to you there. So if there are no further questions, a lot of nice comments coming on, which is really lovely. Thank you. We'll keep those forever, and we'll also allow us all to be and go and get our dinner, because I haven't had mine tonight. So thanks again, everyone, and for those that are booked in next week, we shall see you. For those that haven't, who would like to, do book in for next week, and we'll hopefully see you then too. Okay, thanks very much, and we'll allow Tricia to close the session down, and for you all to log off as you're ready to go. And thanks again, everyone.
Night, guys. Thank you.
Thank you. Good night.